In this special entry in the Disney Villains Retrospective, we're taking a break from animated films and animation in general. Instead, we're looking at the villains created for the many Disney theme parks. As you know, I love doing these deep dives, but I have imposed a few rules on myself to keep this whole thing relatively focused. The villains have to have been created for the theme park specifically, and not for any non-theme park spin-offs or derivative works. For example, we'll talk about the scallywags found in the Pirates of the Caribbean attraction, but not the ones created for the Pirates movies. And yes, I'm aware that some of those movie pirates have made the transition into the attraction, but that will still rule them out. Additionally, I'm using the same principle as the rest of this retrospective regarding predators. I don't view predators as villains, if all they're doing is following their basic instincts. That means we won't have savage beasts like the Yeti or the lava monster on this list. With that out of the way, we'll begin our villainous rundown in the Magic Kingdom before moving on to other parks. Every Disney park has its own Magic Kingdom with varying rides and layouts. I'm basing this video on the Disneyland layout, but we'll be talking about Florida and the international parks as well. We begin our tour on Main Street, USA, which serves as the entrance to almost every version of the Magic Kingdom. You're probably wondering why I'm even bothering with Main Street. It has no major attractions aside from the railroad, and it presents an idealized take on the turn of the century. If any villains were around back then, they wouldn't be here in the sanitized version. In response, I'll direct you to the Main Street Cinema at Disneyland. Today, it plays old Mickey Mouse cartoons, but in its early days, it played actual silent films, including The Phantom of the Opera with Lon Chaney. And during the 60s, the horrifying Phantom himself would prowl around the cinema. Reportedly, he would pretend to be a statue and frighten unsuspecting guests. It doesn't seem like the kind of thing that would fly today at a Disney park, even during the Halloween season. I don't think every guest would appreciate it, but I'm sure there were some funny interactions back in the day. And we do know that he met Andre the Giant at one point, so that's pretty neat. I don't know if being a creepy prankster makes this Phantom a full-blown villain, but I think it serves as a nice start to our list. Besides, we'll be seeing a much more evil Phantom later on. But for now, let's move on to Adventureland. In the heart of the jungle, we find an abandoned temple, the Temple of the Forbidden Eye. And inside that temple, we find our next villain, Mara. Mara is, in reality, a deity associated with Buddhism, a demon who represents everything that will lead one away from enlightenment. In the plot of the attraction, people who venture into the temple will find 3 chambers, each with an enormous statue of Mara. Each chamber will grant a different gift: eternal youth, wealth, or the power to see into the future. However, if a visitor looks into the eyes of the statue, they will be doomed. Inevitably, no matter how many times you visit the attraction, someone will look into Mara's eyes, and the journey becomes a perilous escape with help from Dr. Jones. Although everyone gets out safely, Mara does not make it easy, using falling rocks, lava, lasers, and more to kill the intruders. Mara is voiced by James Earl Jones, although for a short time he was replaced by Neil Patrick Harris. Fans did not like the new voice, and the Jones audio was quickly reinstated. The Tokyo DisneySea version of the attraction takes place in a different temple, the Temple of the Crystal Skull. It's a similar experience, but Mara is replaced by a crystal skull, although this attraction predates the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull movie by 7 years. So no aliens here, just a magic spirit residing in a skull. The most notable villains out in the lawless western world of Frontierland never actually made it into the park. If you're a fan of Disney parks, you might have heard of the unbuilt attraction, the Western River Expedition. To sum it up, this would have been an elaborate water ride that was meant to be the Disney World equivalent of Disneyland's Pirates of the Caribbean, but with a cowboy flair. Guests ended up demanding a pirate ride in Florida as well, and the plans were scrapped. Along with many amusing vignettes involving cowboys, saloon girls, natives, and desert flora and fauna, guests would meet the villains in question twice, a gang of robbers who wear bandanas over their faces. Their horses do the same. The robbers are first seen holding up a stagecoach, and they warn riders that they will meet again. At the ride's finale, the Banditos would attack again, but riders were to plunge down a waterfall to safety. A similar-looking scene made its way into the Epcot attraction World of Motion, but these Banditos only appeared in one scene. The ride had a fun sense of humor, but regrettably, it didn't include the masked horses. While we never got the Western River, we did receive the beloved Big Thunder Mountain Railroad, which at least retains a few of the river ride's ideas. It also has a villain of sorts, Barnabas T. Bullion, whose appearance was modeled after Imagineer Tony Baxter. According to the ride's story, this is the man who financed the Big Thunder Mining Company to dig up gold around the mountain. The Sacred Mountain spirits didn't take kindly to the miners, and despite many warnings from locals and employees alike, Bullion continued to push forward. Natural disasters began to occur caused by the spirits, and the mining eventually ceased. Although Bullion is not quite as evil as a similar character we'll be discussing when we get to Phantom Manor, his stubbornness and greed most likely caused the death of many of his workers. A comic book series about Big Thunder showed a slightly more sympathetic take on Bullion. Although he's initially still ruthless and stubborn, a good deal of the story is about him regaining his humanity. The Banditos from the Western River Expedition also appear, but they are now anti-heroes rather than cutthroat robbers. And their horses don't wear masks either, so really, what's the point? In the earliest days of Disneyland, much like the Phantom of Main Street, a real ornery varmint used to prowl among the guests. Black Bart was clearly a charlatan, with a few aces stuck not so inconspicuously in his top hat. Unlike many cast members, he did not adhere to the Disney look, and sported some snazzy facial hair. He would apparently antagonize the guests in what was meant to be a playful fashion. He was known to startle folks by firing blanks at them, and on one account, he actually told some guests that they would be better off going to Knott's Berry Farm. He would also regularly battle with the hero of Frontierland, Sheriff Lucky, having a daily shootout. The sheriff always won, of course. According to the book Mouse Tales, full of fun anecdotes about working at Disneyland, guests tended to find him rather abrasive, and he was phased out in the early 60s. On the other hand, there are some nice photos out there of him having a great time with some guests, so it might have just depended on who he chose to interact with. Like the Phantom of Main Street, I'm not surprised he's been retired, but it probably would have been fun to see him in action. Critter Country is next on our list. I know what you might be thinking. I already did an entry on Brer Fox and Brer Bear, so what other villains are there to talk about? Well, much like the Western River Bandits, this section will deal with some villains we never actually received. When a Flume ride was being developed, rather than have it be themed to Song of the South, one idea was to have it essentially be an extension of the Country Bear Jamboree. The attraction was titled Moonshine Express, and guests would be pitted against some other bears, not friendly ones like the singing bears over in Grizzly Hall. A sheriff character, who was meant to be Henry the MC Bear's brother, would explain that these nasty bears are bootleggers. Guests would be armed with rifles and instructed to shoot any moonshine stills they saw along the way. Halfway through the ride, the bad bears would find out about the guests and start returning fire. I can't find any concept art for this ride, but I'm guessing the bad bears would have resembled Lumpjaw. The Disney execs vetoed the idea, not liking the concept of arming guests with rifles in a lighthearted ride. Never mind that Disneyland has always had shooting galleries. Another shooting ride was planned for Disney's MGM Studios later on, called Dick Tracy's Crime Stoppers. This ride was shelved after the underperformance of the Dick Tracy movie. Guests finally received a shooting ride with the various Buzz Lightyear attractions seen around the world. Whatever's going to happen with the Princess and the Frog overlay, I'm guessing we won't see any rifles. Then again... New Orleans Square is home to two of the most well-known Disney attractions, Pirates of the Caribbean and the Haunted Mansion. These rides boast some impressive rogues galleries, to the point that they'll both get their own section in this video. Disneyland has never been without pirates. The park opened with Peter Pan's Flight, and Hook's own pirate ship served as a restaurant. For a while, there were plans in the mid-60s for an indoor Disney park in St. Louis that was to have had a Jean Lafitte ride. Interestingly, another ride proposed for the park would have featured Outlaws Frank and Jesse James. Walt vetoed it, not wanting to glorify criminals. But apparently, pirates were so much fun that Walt gave them a pass. Pirates of the Caribbean was conceived as a wax museum full of elaborate pirate-themed displays. Even in early concept art, we can see that there was always a sense of fun and adventure surrounding these reprehensible characters. That's probably one of the biggest draws to the ride. It takes these scummy characters who do scummy things and makes them almost likable. The pirates proving to be surprisingly endearing is what a lot of the ride is dependent on. The attraction follows a crew of pirates who ransack a city, terrorizing its citizens, and ultimately burn it down. There's no last-minute cavalry, there's no comeuppance for the villains, period. The last time we see them, they're drunkenly partying. Maybe they were caught, maybe some of them died in a fire, maybe they all accidentally shot each other, we don't know, and the ride works better with that ambiguity. The Disney World version, before Captain Jack moved in, ended on an even more triumphant note, with the pirates discovering the hidden treasure they've been searching for. Only the Paris version somewhat alleviated this by moving the skeleton caverns to the end of the ride instead of the beginning. For all of Walt's talk of not wanting to glorify criminals, the attraction sure doesn't make any efforts to condemn them. Even the infectious Yo-Ho theme song is the pirates bragging about all their wicked ways. And, like their mommies and dads, it's hard for us not to love them in spite of ourselves. There are quite a few memorable pirates seen within the attraction. Although they don't have the same elaborate, semi-official backstories that the Haunted Mansion ghosts have, more on them shortly, these characters still leave quite the impression. A Blackbeard-inspired captain used to lead the attack on the city. In 2006, he was replaced with Barbossa from the movies. Another pirate wallows in the mud with some happy-looking pigs. My favorite one is the poor sap who's got one foot on dry land and the other in a rowboat, all as he struggles to hold his pile of loot. One of the most memorable scenes in the ride has a group of prisoners trying to break out of their cell by stealing the keys. Unfortunately for them, the keys are in the mouth of a scruffy dog that doesn't look like he wants to come any closer. Another scoundrel of note is the infamous Pooped Pirate. Why is he pooped, you ask? He's been attempting to, chercher la femme, as it were. While the woman in question got away, the pirate has managed to snatch some of her garments, so she literally gave him the slip. The outraged woman hides in a barrel nearby. At least that's how the scene originally played out. In an effort to clean up some of the ride's racier bits, the woman in the barrel was removed in later years. The Pooped Pirate was made into a glutton in the mid-90s, and 10 years after that, Jack Sparrow was incorporated into the scene. Unfortunately, the Pooped Pirate is not holding Jack's underwear, that's for tipsy soccer moms to try, but is instead studying a treasure map while Jack spies on him from the barrel. The most notable pirates, at least as far as this video is concerned, are the Auctioneer and the one, the only, Redhead. As skeezy as the whole wench auction is, the Auctioneer leading it is downright charming, once again making these pirates come across as surprisingly likable. The rotund woman being auctioned, officially known as Tiny, is not who the pirates are interested in. It's a gorgeous red-headed woman who has their full attention. Like the Pooped Pirate, this scene was altered in later versions of the ride. Instead of being a wench auction, the auction is now for stolen goods, and the redhead is helping the auctioneer rather than being sold by him. She also has a name. Brace yourselves, her name is Red. It's certainly fitting. Even without the alterations to the scene, it's always been implied that Red was destined to be a pirate. For one thing, she never seemed all that put off by the pirate peanut gallery. And in the skeleton caverns at the beginning of the attraction, a portrait can be seen of Red decked out in full pirate attire, minus most of her actual clothes, enjoying the finer things. I don't think there are full credits out there for everyone who voiced each individual pirate, but I can list a few here. Paul Frees voiced the captain, the Pooped Pirate, and the auctioneer. The Pooped Pirate's current dialogue is supplied by Corey Burton. The pirate dunking the town's poor mayor was voiced by J. Pat O'Malley. In the current version of the scene, he's questioning the mayor on the whereabouts of Jack Sparrow because of corporate synergy or some nonsense. The actor doing these lines is currently unknown. Ex Atencio, who wrote the ride's script and lyrics, can be heard as various pirates, as can the distinctly baritone Thurl Ravenscroft. Finally, Red's dialogue is performed by Grey Delazile. We have now reached my favorite attraction, the Haunted Mansion. An important thing to note about the mansion is that although there were several different plot lines considered, the ride ultimately opened with no real plot. It's also important to note that most of the ghosts in the mansion are ambivalent in how they're portrayed. They might be sinister, they might enjoy scaring us, or they might just want to entertain us. It could vary from ghost to ghost, and the ride never really gives us an answer, which just adds to the fun. Before talking about some of the ghosts found within the stately halls, I'm going to cover the ones that never made it past the drawing board. One of the earliest plots considered for the mansion, back when it was going to be a walkthrough attraction, was about a former pirate, Captain Gore, settling down and getting married. The story shared some elements with the Bluebeard folktale, and the captain's wife, Priscilla, was to discover Gore's terrible secret one stormy night. Reading the captain's old journal, she would have found out that he was really the dreaded pirate Black Bart. No relation to the guy in Frontierland, I assume. The captain then murdered her and threw her body down a well. Priscilla ultimately got the last laugh, along with some pirate ghosts, haunting Captain Gore until he hung himself. A different draft had the opposite idea, with the bride being the villain and her groom being the victim. The bride would have been revealed to be a voodoo queen and would torment her husband, driving him to madness. Even though Captain Gore never made it into the ride, His legacy has lived on. 2 separate Haunted Mansion comics focused on him. One was about how he attempted to reform and bought the soon-to-be Haunted Mansion. Of course, it didn't work out. Another story had him as a pirate ghost looking for hidden treasure inside the mansion, with his end goal being to escape and terrorize mortals. Back to the unbuilt walkthrough attraction, another idea was a large hairy arm that would reach out of secret passageways and grab at the tour guide. The guide would keep narrowly escaping until he'd finally get caught as the guests were exiting. In story notes, the hairy arm was known as Harry the Arm, so again, a fitting name. When the mansion became an actual ride and not a walkthrough, a hideous, one-eyed cat was considered for a villain. According to the ghost host's narration, this cat hates all mortals, especially happy ones. The cat's glowing red eye would be glimpsed throughout the ride, and he would finally appear at the end, where his face would turn into a human skull. Although this horrifying scene never made it into the ride, the cat is referenced in both Disneyland and Disney World today, as a statue in the loading area at Disneyland, and as an image in the Disney World queue. One of the most legendary unused ideas was a pre-show area called the Museum of the Weird. Imagineer Rolly Crump designed a truly, weird waiting area with such surreal ideas and concepts, it apparently gave Walt Disney nightmares. One of the many beings guests would encounter was a character called the Mistress of Evil. The witch would appear in flames and rise into the air screaming. While describing the scene, Crump admitted that he took some inspiration from Disney's other Mistress of Evil, Maleficent. This character was eventually used in the Seekers of the Weird comic series as the leader of a death cult. That's pretty evil. As I said, when the mansion actually opened, there was no real plot. But with so many distinct ghosts and a number of tie-in materials over the years, it didn't take long for some backstories to be created, ranging from unofficial to semi-official. A lot of popular interpretations of the ghosts come from some stories written by the mansion's cast members in a collection called The Ghost Gallery. Although these are entirely unofficial, some of the ideas have crept into the actual canon, like the names of the hitchhiking ghosts, Ezra, Gus, and Phineas. In the Ghost Gallery stories, Madame Leota was one of the main villains, and was responsible for several residents' deaths, and the reason the mansion is haunted in the first place. Her daughter, Little Leota, the ghost hostess seen at the end of the ride, had also taken several lives herself. Some official comics retain some of these ideas, and have Leota as the person who drew the ghosts of the mansion. Other portrayals have her as being neutral or even benevolent. Although I haven't been active in the Haunted Mansion fandom for the last 10 or 15 years, I recall that although a lot of people took inspiration from the Ghost Gallery, myself included, it was generally accepted that everyone picked and chose their favorite versions of the characters to write. For the most part, Disney's official stance on the ghosts is that they're sometimes dangerous, but mostly pranksters overall. For whatever reason, the ghosts were included among the Disney villains in the House of Villains movie, so take that as you will. There is at least one ghost in the mansion who is confirmed to be evil, and is often served as one of the main antagonists in the tie-in material, and she's waiting up in the attic. For a long time, the Haunted Mansion's attic was regarded as the scariest part of the attraction. For some, it was the only truly frightening scene. Ghouls would pop out of the various piles of junk screaming at the guests. And all the while, a mysterious bride stood in the corner silently watching. The original bride character was a true enigma. Was she tragic? Was she sinister? That was unclear, but what was clear was her creepiness. She went through a few design changes over the years, depending on which theme park you were in. A skull face, a blank face with glowing eyes, a blue face, but under the right lighting conditions, she was always an ominous sight. In 2006, the original bride was removed from the Disneyland attic and replaced with a new character, Constance Hatchaway. In 2007, Disney World did the same with their attic. Constance is physically performed by Julia Lee and voiced by Kat Cressida. This bride is the ultimate Black Widow. As guests approach her, they pass by several portraits of her with her many husbands. In each picture, the husband's head disappears. Constance herself grins madly at the guests while brandishing her hatchet. Technically, Constance has always been in the Haunted Mansion, even if her addition in the attic scene is somewhat recent. The woman seen in stretching room portraits sitting on a gravestone of a murdered man is apparently an elderly Constance. The idea of a Black Widow isn't completely new with Constance either. As detailed earlier, the mansion's pre-development stories always had something about a wedding or a marriage gone wrong. When the Disneyland ride first opened, the bride did have a groom. As her heart would beat ever so loudly, The groom's head would disappear and reappear in a hat box he was holding. The pop-up ghosts that would screech at guests, meanwhile, would actually pop out of hat boxes. Putting two and two together would lead guests to conclude that the groom and the other ghosts were perhaps victims of the creepy, expressionless bride. The legendary Hatbox Ghost was removed after about a month since his effect didn't work properly. He was eventually brought back to Disneyland in 2015, where the missing head connection had even more strength with Constance. For a relatively recent addition to the mansion, Constance has been popular with Disney. She's been one of the main villains in 2 Haunted Mansion comics, although one of them portrays her as more of a high school mean girl than an actual threat. She was also the main villain of the Muppets Haunted Mansion special, played by Taraji P. Henson. And speaking of ghostly brides, that makes a nice segue into a different Haunted Mansion. Unlike the American and Tokyo Haunted Mansions, which value atmosphere over story, the mansion in Disneyland Paris has a more in-depth plot. It all revolves around a bride and her obsessive phantom. The attraction opened in 1992 with a slightly ambiguous storyline in regards to who the titular phantom was. In 2019, the attraction had several enhancements and a restructured plot that did away with any ambiguities. For the sake of this video, I'll cover them both. In the original plot, a wealthy businessman named Henry Ravenswood established the Big Thunder Mining Company in the town of Thunder Mesa. Like the character of Barnabas T. Bullion, his recklessness in disrupting the spirits of the mountain caused countless deaths. This included himself and his wife in an earthquake caused by the spirits. Before his death, Ravenswood scared off any potential suitors of his lovely daughter, Melanie. Once he was dead, Melanie was finally able to marry someone. However, on her wedding day, her groom disappeared. It was rumored that her stately manor was haunted by a phantom, who some people thought was the ghost of Henry Ravenswood. According to legend, the phantom is the one who killed the groom, wanting Melanie for himself. Distraught by the loss of her groom, Melanie wandered the manor alone in her wedding dress, followed by the mocking phantom. They say both spirits still haunt those halls. It's the Great Expectations Phantom of the Opera crossover we always wanted. That original storyline hints very heavily that the Phantom is Melanie's father, but never outright says it. The 2019 version is 100% clear that the Phantom is Henry Ravenswood. It also changes the story so that Ravenswood killed 4 suitors when he was alive. The suitor from the original story that was killed by a ghost is never mentioned or seen in the revamped version. The layout for about 75% of Phantom Manor is similar to the Haunted Mansion, but Melanie and the Phantom are seen in almost every room. The Phantom is often floating near or behind Melanie, forever watching over her, driving her further to madness, even in death. He also has his sights on us, the intruders. In the original stretching room, we can see him standing in the attic's rafters with the dead body of Melanie's groom hanging from a noose. In the revised version, the groom's body is gone, with the noose being meant for us. In the ending, the Phantom stands by a tree with a noose hanging from it and an open coffin. In the original ending, he also peered out from behind the doom buggies in the mirrors, acting more as a sinister version of the hitchhiking ghosts. While I like the ambiguous nature of the story, I can imagine it was confusing for some guests. Some of these changes make the story a little easier to follow. For instance, the Phantom's final appearance by the coffin originally showed him as looking different than the other figures of the ride. Instead of being a skeleton, he looked more like a rotting corpse. Even though this was one of the scariest animatronics to be featured in the ride, it was perhaps unclear to some people that this was meant to be the same character. The revised version has the skeleton Phantom instead. There was also a tragic scene that was altered, although the new version is pretty sad as well. After passing the corpse Phantom, guests would see Melanie the bride, now a skeleton, pointing the way out. In the updated version, Melanie appears in the mirrors at the end, begging for us to marry her. Even in death, she has no peace, and all because of her awful father. And that brings us to the Phantom's relation to Melanie. This goes beyond an overprotective parent. In early live appearances at the park shows, and even a sing-along tape, Melanie and the Phantom acted romantically toward each other. Again, it had a very Phantom of the Opera vibe, with the Phantom even carrying her over the threshold. When it wasn't entirely clear if the Phantom was her father or not, fans could happily say, no, it's just a creepy possessive ghost. Uncomfortable? Maybe, but at least it's not incestuous. The redone plot adds a layer of creepiness that perhaps goes beyond the fun kind of horror. The Phantom has appeared as a walk-around character from time to time, some versions scarier than others. His earliest walk-arounds were truly frightening, while later versions in the 2010s and onward have him looking grim, but much more approachable. The Phantom's voice is provided by the one and only Vincent Price. While first doing a mock-up of the attraction, Imagineers used Price's laugh from Michael Jackson's Thriller as a temp track for the Phantom. They liked it so much, they reached out to Price himself to do a new laugh for the ride, and to narrate it. Price's narration was in English, and was removed 2 months into the ride's operation, replaced by Gérald Chevalier's French narration. However, Price's laugh remained. The new version of the ride has reinstated some of Price's narration, altering them with French lines done by Bernard Allain. The website Phantom Manor Legends points out that the Phantom's design might have been influenced by 2 Vincent Price characters. His normal skeletal design resembles the Dr. Death character from the movie Madhouse, while his corpse design resembles the titular character from the abominable Dr. Phibes. While California, Florida, Tokyo, and Paris all have their own wonderful takes on the mansion, Hong Kong's is very different, though no less impressive. In Chinese culture, departed ancestors are taken seriously, so some of the lighthearted and sinister looks of the afterlife seen in the other mansions were deemed to be insensitive. The Imagineers came up with a brilliant way to give guests their own harrowing journey through a mansion with supernatural elements, but not actual ghosts. In this attraction, we tour the mansion of famed explorer Henry Mystic. One of his treasures is an ancient music box, which is said to be able to bring inanimate objects to life. His curious monkey, Albert, turns the box on, proving its powers to be real. Unfortunately, the fun doesn't last long, and the magic quickly becomes a curse as the objects turn on Albert and us, threatening to destroy the entire manor around us. I won't dwell too much on this one, since it's unclear if the music box is actually sentient and/or evil. As far as the ride is concerned, it doesn't really matter, since it's all about a fun experience first and foremost. The enchanted objects appearing to target Albert for violence does imply that the box isn't exactly friendly, but at the end of the day, who really knows? When we get to Tokyo DisneySea, we'll be discussing a similar, much more openly vicious artifact, so stay tuned. As we end the Haunted Mansion section, I do want to shout out 3 great sources for any mansion fan. The websites Long Forgotten and Phantom Manor Legends, and the book Boundless Realms by Fox Nolte. Any fan of the mansion can spend hours with these, all of them highly recommended. Moving away from the ghosts of old, and into that great big beautiful tomorrow, we're hitting Tomorrowland next. Walt Disney World's Tomorrowland was once home to the cult classic attraction ExtraTERRORestrial Alien Encounter. Although the show revolves around guests being menaced in the dark by a ferocious alien, the alien is not the villain we'll be discussing. Our villain is an entire corporation. In the show, guests are visitors to an expo held by XS Tech. The purpose is to demonstrate their new teleportation device to us, gullible Earthlings with plenty of spending money. Their leader, Chairman L.C. Clench, played by Jeffrey Jones, claims that they're not trying to fleece us, but his demeanor says otherwise. XS Tech is not evil in a conquer the galaxy kind of way. Rather, their evil is the kind you see in many faceless corporations, the kind of businesses that do more harm than good with their technological advancements. The device XS created has a lot of potential to benefit everyone, but they're so focused on making a quick profit that they don't properly test it, and we, the guests, almost become a casualty. This is demonstrated in the pre-show, where a test subject, a cute little alien named Skippy, gets fried by a faulty transporter. The robot running the demonstration was originally named Tom 2000 and voiced by Phil Hartman. Imagine Lionel Hutz trying his best and still failing, and you'll have the right idea. He was genuinely apologetic to Skippy, and being Phil Hartman, he was also very funny. While his scene fit the theme of the attraction well, it didn't fit the dark tone of the main show. For this reason, Tom was changed to a robot named Sir, voiced by the silky, sinister Tim Curry. Sir, unlike Tom, took delight in tormenting Skippy, and it almost seemed like he zapped the poor guy for fun. After charring the little alien once, Sir went even further and teleported him again, this time suspending the alien's particles in mid-air, literally leaving him hanging. XS Tech might be negligent and corrupt as a whole, but Sir was probably the most openly evil. One wonders why they'd use him as a spokesman at all. I chalk it up to faulty programming. It's par for the course with XS. In the main show, 2 hapless technicians, Spinlock and Dr. Femus, played by Kevin Pollak and Kathy Najimy, plan to transport a human from the theater to their planet. Making a spur-of-the-moment choice, Clench decides to beam himself to Earth, and the pressure is on more than ever for Spinlock and Femus to get it done correctly, and even more importantly, to get it done quickly. Femus, the most level-headed of the characters, wants to take the time to ensure everyone's safety, but her concerns fall on deaf ears. As a result of their haste, a hungry alien is teleported to the theater instead. I really don't think of the titular alien as a villain. He falls under the category of predator, and nothing suggests any real malice in his actions. After all, if you were suddenly taken from Earth and plopped in front of a free, delicious buffet, what would you do? Although Spinlock, Femus, and XS Tech as a whole end up with egg on their faces, Clench is the one who ultimately suffers the most. After he enters the teleportation tube, he is accidentally sent to a hostile planet, with the alien getting sent in his place. He's not recovered at the show's end, and I always assumed he was eaten by some of the alien's friends. This was not always the case. The original filmed ending had Clench get sent back to his home planet, looking as charred as Skippy had been earlier. Now pissed off, he begins to threaten Spinlock and Femus, who opt to send him back off into space, rather than face any kind of punishment. At least that was the idea. The media portions of the show were directed by Imagineer Jerry Rees, who wanted to be able to work on programming the show as well to make sure everything had a proper narrative flow the audience could follow. Initially, he didn't have that chance, and guests had trouble understanding certain parts of the story. To further complicate the fate of Clench, the original show had audio of him inside the closed transportation tube, banging on it and demanding to be let out. Rees was called back shortly after the attraction's opening and made adjustments, including completely cutting Clench's fate. Clench actually did make one more appearance in a Disney Quest game. Called Invasion, an extraterrestrial alien encounter, the game had guests use XS Tech vehicles to fight what else but more aliens. Clench appeared in the introduction footage, opportunistic as ever. It should definitely be noted that the earliest ideas for Alien Encounter were based on the Alien movies, which feature their own soulless corporation. One story draft by George Lucas even had XS Tech initially planning on feeding guests to the alien. That's enough of Tomorrowland, but we're still moving forward in time to Future World. Heading out of the Magic Kingdom and into Epcot, our next stop is at the 3D extravaganza Captain EO. This one also played at Disneyland's Tomorrowland, but it opened a week earlier in Florida, so I'm counting it as an Epcot attraction. In the movie, our heroes, led by Captain EO, travel to a dystopian garbage planet ruled by our villain, the Supreme Leader. She's a wonderfully performed character, with her actress, Angelica Houston, hamming it up like no one's business. The role was originally offered to Shelley Duvall, who found the costume to be too claustrophobic. This junkyard Medusa menaces the audience with her claws, remember, 3D, and threatens to turn our heroes into trash cans. Captain EO gets singled out and is to be tortured in her dungeon for 100 years. The heroes want to give her a gift that will reveal her inner beauty. Since Captain EO is Michael Jackson, the gift is, of course, music. And through song and dance, they bring joy and laughter into the hearts of every robot, alien, and whip warrior on the planet. Seeing the grungy henchmen get magically turned into sexy dancers is more than a little reminiscent of another Michael Jackson movie, The Wiz. The Supreme Leader is the last to be transformed, turning her dumpster of a planet into an idyllic paradise. And just as quickly as he came, Captain EO and his team leaves the denizens to presumably enjoy their New World Order. Pure 80s cheese on the highest level. About a year after Captain EO opened, a group of cast members filmed their own parody, Captain Eeyore, using character costumes. The Supreme Leader in this version is a Minnie Mouse that crawled out of Tim Burton's deepest, darkest nightmares. I don't want to give too much away. This whole short needs to be seen to be believed. Most Disney fans are aware of Captain EO, so to contrast that, we'll look at some forgotten villains from a more obscure Epcot show. Skylaidescope was an aerial stunt show performed in the World Showcase Lagoon. In the show, the beloved character Dreamfinder is trying to create rainbows, but our villains, Ma and Pa Dragon, disrupt the festivities. Video footage of the dragons in action is scarce, but they appear to be performed by boats made to look like dragons, with 10 smaller dragons, the Dragonettes, accompanying them. Apparently, these creatures are from the Black Lagoon, and I guess they're not fans of rainbows. Dreamfinder, of course, triumphs in the end, and turns the dragons into dragonflies. It's probably for the best that Figment wasn't around to see this. I can only imagine what his reaction would have been. Another odd water-themed show was Splashtacular, which was performed at the Fountain of Nations in Future World. If you've watched my Maleficent video, and by the view count it looks like you all have, thank you. Sorry, where was I? If you've watched my Maleficent video, you'll recognize the plot of this one as a reworked version of the Tokyo It's Magical show. That was the show where Maleficent tried to steal everyone's colors and summoned a dragon that fought Mickey and Minnie. In this show, to fit with the future aesthetic, Maleficent has been replaced with some sort of alien character. The only official name I've seen her given was in an episode of Walt Disney World Inside and Out, where she's simply called the Evil Alien. The Evil Alien tells Mickey and friends that intergalactic wars have robbed her planet of all colors and life, and she plans to steal ours. That's all the information we have to go on, since like Ma and Pa Dragon, this is a character created solely for a temporary theme park show. In the show's most extreme 90s moment, the alien summons a robot dinosaur that shoots rockets. Oh, and to top that all off, he's called the Terrorsaurus. The dinosaur's animatronic was reused in the Tomorrowland Galaxy Search show, where he played a friendly, alien Elvis impersonator. Nice to see he has range. Our final Epcot villains used to work in the Arendelle Pavilion. Oh, sorry, I meant the Norway Pavilion. In the former Maelstrom attraction, guests would find themselves in Troll Country, encountering some unfriendly creatures from Scandinavian folklore. The most notable one was a three-headed troll that did not appreciate the presence of humans. Next to them lurked a Nuke, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, with glowing eyes. The three-headed troll would cast a spell on the boats, sending them careening backwards almost out of the ride entirely. As the back of the boat teetered over a waterfall, another troll would emerge and change the boat's course. Guests would careen over a waterfall anyway, but at least it was forward. We know that the trolls send us backwards because they hate humans, but the real question is, what's Elsa's excuse? As a treat, here's a picture of Imagineer Paul Turrigino with a model of the three-headed troll. Bet you didn't know he had suspenders. Our tram tour will make a brief stop at Disney's Hollywood Studios next. At the much-missed Great Movie Ride, guests' journey through film history would be hijacked by one of four characters. A male gangster named Muggsy Takata, a female gangster named Muggsy Takata, that's Muggsy with an I, a male outlaw named Kid Carson, or a female outlaw named Kate Durango. All the criminals were played by real cast members. They also had some henchmen they would abandon when things got tough, although their henchies were animatronics. The Western outlaw had an accomplice named Snakes. The gangsters had Squid and Beans, and got in a shootout with rival gangsters, Brains, Legs, and Weasel. These villains provided a bit of comic relief along the way, finding themselves completely out of their element when faced with, say, a xenomorph. Hey, they made it into the parks after all. After passing our good friend Indiana Jones struggling with the Ark of the Covenant, the crooks would be tempted by another treasure. This treasure belonged to Anubis, and the villains would be turned into skeletons in a puff of smoke when trying to take it. Good thing they didn't go for the Ark. It would have been a lot messier. In Animal Kingdom, we're flashing back to Bambi territory when we look at the fearsome enemy of man, or the destructive side of humanity in general. As I said back when I covered Bambi, the character of Man is an interesting one because he's mostly a villain in the eyes of the animals, while he very well could be one of our friendly neighbors. I've had a few helpful commenters on the video pointing out that many hunters choose to ignore does, especially in the seasons when they're accompanied by their children. So the particular hunter that shot Bambi's mom could still very well be considered a villain, depending on how you view the scene. But as I said, considering hunters overall in Bambi, it's generally a weird gray area. The people we're talking about in Animal Kingdom, however, we can easily more classify as villains because they're poachers. In an effort to teach a grim lesson on conservation, the poachers were part of the original Kilimanjaro safari ride. The otherwise peaceful safari would originally end with poachers being sighted in the area. The vehicles would pass through the poachers' camp, full of ivory tusks, and the poachers would be seen captured a little while down the road, held at gunpoint by the warden. Their captive elephant, Little Red, was safe and sound. Preview versions of the attraction before the park's opening would have shown the dead body of Little Red's mother, Big Red, a victim of ivory poaching. Although Big Red was a prop, every animal seen prior to her was real, so the already dark sight was even more traumatic for guests with that in mind. Big Red was removed by opening day, and over the years the poacher plot was phased out. It was a noble effort to teach an important lesson, but it never quite gelled. On a more fanciful note, we also have a dragon. Much like the Western River Expedition, the Beastly Kingdom is one of the legendary unbuilt features in a Disney theme park. This magical land would have been dedicated to mythical creatures. An elaborate roller coaster was planned with a vain, greedy dragon as the main antagonist. Guests would enter a crumbling tower and would meet a gang of bats that wanted to rob the dragon of his treasure. It's hard to say if the bats were entirely good guys, most likely they weren't, but the guests would have boarded suspended cars and flown through the castle. The dragon would be asleep in his treasure chamber and would inevitably be woken by the bats. The guests would then have to make a thrilling exit, with the bats assuring them on the way out that they'd be successful next time. For the final stretch of this entry, we're heading to Asia, first stopping at Tokyo DisneySea. The Sinbad dark ride always had villains, but they vary depending on the version of the attraction. Either the original version that opened with the park in 2001, or the revamped version from 2007. The original ride, Sinbad's Seven Voyages, was criticized for being too dark. This somewhat cynical story followed Sinbad on his search for riches. Sinbad himself, although not a villain, appeared to be mostly interested in plundering treasure, with his crew making him look better by comparison by acting even greedier and more incompetent. For instance, we see the crew at one point finding a cave full of gold and doing their best Scrooge McDuck impressions. They don't notice our first villain of interest, a hideous green giant, peering in at them. This is his treasure, and the next scene shows the giant attacking the hapless men, laughing at their fear. A later scene features a tribe of fierce ape people attacking Sinbad's crew and the guests. These screaming monkeys are genuinely frightening, especially their pitch-black eyes. When the ride was redone, there was more of an emphasis on friendship and compassion. Sinbad does still receive treasure, but his first goal is to make friends and to help others. The giant and the apes are now friendly characters, and the giant gives him treasure as thanks. He makes peace with the apes using musical instruments. The new ride still had some minor villains. On the Giant's Island, guests would see a band of black-cloaked pirates attempting to steal some eggs from the legendary giant rockbird. They were no match for Sinbad, the Rock, and Sinbad's new adorable tiger cub, Shandu. By stark contrast, the original version of the ride had the roles of the thieving pirates being played by Sinbad's own crew. You couldn't get plushes out of those guys, though, hence the addition of Shandu. And cynicism aside, Shandu really does make for an incredibly cute character. Our next Tokyo DisneySea attraction is their Tower of Terror. I'm skipping the American and French versions, since they didn't really have any villains per se. The bellhops are creepy, but I can't really call them bad guys. There was also a made-for-TV movie with an antagonist, but again, this is about the attractions themselves and not the media inspired by them. That brings us to Hotel Hightower. The hotel was built by Harrison Hightower III, a man who was always meant to have a hotel named after him. But Hightower is more than a wealthy businessman, he's an adventurer and explorer. Much like his contemporary, Henry Mystic of Mystic Manor, Hightower collected many treasures over the years, often in less than noble ways. Henry Mystic and the other members of the Adventurers Club are probably no better than Hightower when it comes to grave robbing, but even outside that, Hightower is stated to be a ruthless, unpleasant person in his day-to-day life. Maybe if he had a monkey sidekick, he'd have better publicity. When guests enter the hotel, they see Hightower's last great acquisition before his mysterious disappearance. The Shiriki Utundu idol, which Hightower stole from the fearsome Utundu tribe in the Congo. Despite the tribe's terrible reputation, they didn't seem to react at all when Hightower made off with their treasure. This should have been a warning sign, but pride cometh before the fall, and since this is a Tower of Terror ride, we know that it will be quite a fall indeed. The supposedly cursed idol came with several rules, one of which being it can't be thrown or given away, but there's no rule against someone stealing it. Other rules include treating it with respect and not keeping it near fire. Hightower broke both of these the last night he was seen, when he put his cigar out on the idol. After he left for the elevator, so the story goes, there was a massive power outage. Hightower's screams were heard, but his body was never found. Although Hightower can indeed be seen as a villain, the other villain in the attraction is the idol itself. Unlike the Mystic Manor music box, whose sentience is debatable, the idol is definitely alive and has its sight on the guests as its next victims. In the elevator, they find Hightower, trapped in the spirit realm, who warns guests that they will be next. Of course, everyone makes it out okay, with Hightower warning them from regions beyond that they might not be so lucky next time. Hightower is modeled after Imagineer Joe Rohde, who even played him in some promotional materials. The idol's evil cackling is provided by Richard Horvitz. Our final stop is Hong Kong Disneyland. Out of all the parks, Hong Kong has the most interesting take on Halloween. While other ones go for a not-so-scary angle focusing on candy and costumes, Hong Kong's Halloween seems more in line with Fright Fest. There have been some genuinely scary-looking walkthrough attractions over the years, although pictures and videos of them have been tragically scarce. Still, it makes a nice bookend to this video, since our first villain was the creepy Phantom of Main Street Cinema. And speaking of Main Street, a haunted hotel walkthrough on Main Street featured its own ghost bride, Victoria Maxwell. Like Constance, she's always looking for more victims, although her role in the attraction and how much she's featured is somewhat unclear. Even more tantalizing to Disney fans is the Nightmare Experiment and its villain, Professor J.T. Wu. Wu has opened a portal into the world of nightmares, and wants guests to be his guinea pigs, heedless of their safety. guests travel through a series of dark, twisted takes on Disney films, meeting, among other things, a violent Mad Hatter, a very sad Pinocchio, and Dr. Vassiliev's friends on the other side. There were 2 Nightmare Experiment walkthroughs, one in 2016 and one in 2017. The ending of the second version sounds particularly interesting, but sadly I can't find any footage or pictures. Apparently, Hades would have captured Professor Wu and tried to condemn him to the underworld for his crimes. Wu would have turned into a demon and tried to take the guests with him, but Hades would have a rare heroic moment and hold the monster professor off while the guests escaped. I guess a villain like Wu was a more tempting prize for Hades than a bunch of tourists. Whew, and that does it for Disney's theme park villains. In our next entry, we'll be getting back on track with another classic Disney diva, Cruella de Vil.